Imagine a moment when the future of an entire continent hangs by a thread, when a handful of closed-door meetings, tense conversations, and unspoken fears could determine whether millions would live or die. Europe stands on the edge of catastrophe. Armies are mobilizing, borders are trembling, and trust between nations is thin as glass. What happens in these moments far from the battlefield will shape the course of the 20th century. As you listen, think about this question and leave your answer in the comments. Could a different choice at this critical moment have prevented the disaster that followed? Before the outbreak of World War II, Europe was gripped by anxiety and uncertainty. The scars of the First World War were still fresh, economies were fragile, and political extremism was on the rise. Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler had already begun dismantling the post-war order, remilitarizing territories and openly challenging international agreements. Many leaders sensed that another massive conflict was approaching, but how to stop it remained deeply unclear. In this tense atmosphere, attention turned to the possibility of a grand alliance. The Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France each feared German expansion, yet each also distrusted the others. Despite ideological differences and years of suspicion, there was a growing belief that only a united front could deter Hitler. Diplomatic efforts intensified, with negotiations taking place between Moscow and Western governments, and even the United States observing and participating at diplomatic levels, despite its official policy of neutrality. If you want to understand how these secret talks and political calculations shape the world we live in today, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments as we continue this story. The Soviet leadership, led by Joseph Stalin, approached the situation with cold pragmatism. The Soviet Union had suffered enormous losses during the First World War and the subsequent Civil War. Stalin feared that his country might once again be dragged into a devastating conflict without reliable allies. From Moscow's perspective, Britain and France had repeatedly failed to confront Germany decisively, allowing Hitler to grow stronger with each passing year. This raised a troubling question for the Soviets. Could the Western powers truly be trusted to stand firm when war came? On the other side, British and French leaders were deeply uneasy about forming a military alliance with a communist state. Anti-communist sentiment ran strong among political elites, and memories of revolutionary upheaval made cooperation with Moscow politically risky. Still, the threat posed by Germany was becoming impossible to ignore. By the late 1930s, officials in London and Paris began exploring the idea of a tripartite alliance, hoping it might present a credible deterrent to German aggression. Negotiations began, but they moved slowly and awkwardly. Delegations exchanged proposals, debated military commitments, and argued over strategic details. One of the most contentious issues was the question of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union insisted on guarantees that it would be allowed to move its forces through countries like Poland and Romania if Germany attacked. Without such access, Soviet leaders argued, any promise to fight Germany would be meaningless. However, these demands alarmed smaller Eastern European states which feared Soviet occupation as much as German invasion. Poland, in particular, refused to allow Soviet troops on its territory under any circumstances. Polish leaders remembered earlier conflicts with Russia and worried that once Soviet forces entered, they might never leave. Britain and France found themselves caught between appeasing their potential Soviet ally and reassuring their Eastern European partners. This dilemma slowed negotiations to a crawl and deepened mistrust on all sides. Meanwhile, time was running out. German diplomacy was active and aggressive, seeking opportunities to isolate potential enemies. While Western negotiators hesitated and debated, Berlin watched closely, ready to exploit any weakness. Stalin, observing the disunity and indecision of Britain and France, began to consider a radically different option, one that would shock the world and alter the balance of power overnight. As summer approached in 1939, the sense of urgency became overwhelming. Meetings continued, cables crossed Europe, and diplomats worked late into the night. Yet no binding agreement was reached. The failure to overcome mutual suspicion and conflicting interests pushed the negotiations toward collapse, opening the door to a dramatic and unexpected shift in Soviet foreign policy that would soon be revealed, and whose consequences would echo across Europe in ways few could yet imagine. That shift began quietly, through discreet diplomatic channels that bypassed the stalled talks with Britain and France. In Berlin, German leaders understood that a war on two fronts would be disastrous. Securing neutrality or even cooperation from the Soviet Union became a strategic priority. At the same time, Stalin was reassessing his options with ruthless calculation. If the Western powers could not offer firm guarantees, perhaps a temporary arrangement with Germany could buy the Soviet Union time to prepare for an inevitable conflict. Contacts between German and Soviet diplomats intensified during the summer of 1939. What began as cautious exchanges soon evolved into serious negotiations. Both sides recognized that despite their ideological hostility, they shared short-term interests. Germany wanted freedom to act against Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. The Soviet Union wanted security along its western borders and an opportunity to reclaim territories lost after the First World War. While official Soviet representatives continued to meet Western delegations, the real momentum was shifting elsewhere. Stalin allowed parallel negotiations to proceed, carefully weighing which side offered the better deal. The contrast was stark. Talks with Britain and France were slow, uncertain, and burdened by mistrust. German proposals, by comparison, were direct, concrete, and surprisingly generous. Central to these discussions was the question of Eastern Europe. German negotiators signaled a willingness to recognize Soviet interests in regions such as eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania. This was a decisive factor. For Stalin, securing a buffer zone against potential invasion was not merely desirable, it was essential. The idea that these territories could fall under Soviet influence without immediate war was profoundly appealing. On August 23, 1939, the world learned of the result. The Soviet Union and Germany signed what became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who formalized the agreement. Publicly, it was presented as a non-aggression treaty, a promise that neither side would attack the other. To many observers, this alone was shocking. Two regimes that had vilified each other for years now pledged peace. What remained hidden, however, was even more consequential. Alongside the public treaty was a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. Estonia, Latvia, and Finland were placed within the Soviet sphere, while Lithuania initially fell under German influence. This clandestine agreement redrew the map of Eastern Europe without the knowledge or consent of the nations involved. The impact was immediate and profound. In London and Paris, disbelief quickly turned to alarm. Years of diplomatic effort had failed, and the strategic balance had shifted overnight. Germany was no longer threatened by a war on two fronts. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had gained time and territorial promises, but at the cost of aligning itself, however temporarily, with a regime it publicly condemned. For smaller Eastern European states, the pact was a catastrophe. Their fate had been decided in secret, leaving them exposed to invasion and occupation. Poland, in particular, now faced an existential threat from both West and East. Its leaders realized too late that their refusal to cooperate with the Soviet Union, combined with Western hesitation, had left them isolated. Within days, the consequences of the pact became unmistakable. German military preparations accelerated, and diplomatic pressure on Poland intensified. The final barriers to war were collapsing. What had once seemed like a distant possibility now appeared inevitable, set in motion by decisions made far from the front lines, in rooms where maps were marked and borders were treated as bargaining chips. As Europe stood on the brink, the agreement between Berlin and Moscow reshaped expectations and calculations everywhere. Yet even as armies prepared to move, few fully grasped how quickly events would spiral beyond control, or how fragile this new partnership truly was. Beneath the surface of cooperation lay deep suspicion, ambition, and the seeds of a future betrayal that would plunge the continent into an even greater nightmare. The illusion of stability created by the pact dissolved almost immediately. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland, unleashing a carefully planned and devastating invasion. Tanks rolled across borders, aircraft bombed cities, and the world watched as diplomacy gave way to violence. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the official beginning of World War II. Yet the response many had expected, a coordinated defense of Poland, never truly materialized. For the Polish state, the situation was dire. Its military fought with determination, but it was outmatched by Germany's modern tactics and overwhelming firepower. Still, Polish leaders hoped that the Soviet Union might remain neutral or even reconsider its position. That hope vanished on September 17th when Soviet troops entered eastern Poland, acting in accordance with the secret protocol. The country was crushed between two invading powers, its fate sealed by an agreement signed weeks earlier. The Soviet government justified its actions by claiming it was protecting ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians, arguing that the Polish state had effectively collapsed. In reality, the move was a calculated execution of the pact's terms. Soviet forces advanced rapidly, occupying vast territories and dismantling Polish institutions. Thousands of Polish officers, officials, and intellectuals were captured, many of whom would later face imprisonment or execution. Across Europe, reactions were complex and often contradictory. Some communist parties, following directives from Moscow, portrayed the conflict as an imperialist war between capitalist states. Others struggled to reconcile this narrative with the reality of Nazi aggression and Soviet collaboration. In the West, public opinion hardened against both Germany and the Soviet Union, as the moral lines of the conflict appeared increasingly blurred. Despite their formal agreement, relations between Berlin and Moscow remained tense. Cooperation was pragmatic, not friendly. Both sides conducted joint military parades in occupied Polish cities, yet beneath the surface, distrust persisted. Intelligence services monitored each other closely, and military planners began contemplating scenarios in which the partnership might collapse. Economically, the pact also had significant consequences. The Soviet Union supplied Germany with raw materials such as oil, grain, and metals, resources that helped sustain the German war effort during its early stages. In return, Germany provided industrial equipment and military technology. This exchange strengthened Germany's ability to wage war while allowing the Soviet Union to modernize its industry and armed forces. Meanwhile, the map of Eastern Europe was being reshaped. Following the pact, the Soviet Union moved to consolidate its sphere of influence. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were pressured into accepting Soviet bases and later fully incorporated. Finland resisted, leading to the Winter War, a brutal conflict that exposed both Soviet weaknesses and its willingness to use force to secure its borders. Romania was compelled to cede territory as well, further demonstrating how dramatically the balance of power had shifted. For Stalin, these actions were part of a broader strategy. By pushing the Soviet frontier westward, he sought to create a buffer zone that would absorb the shock of any future German attack. At the same time, he believed that a prolonged war between Germany and the Western powers would exhaust all sides, leaving the Soviet Union in a stronger position when the final reckoning came. Yet this strategy rested on dangerous assumptions. It presumed that Germany would respect the pact for years, and that ideological hostility could be indefinitely subordinated to tactical convenience. It also underestimated the speed and scale of German military success in Western Europe. When France collapsed in 1940 and Britain stood alone, the strategic landscape changed yet again, forcing Stalin to reconsider whether time was truly on his side. As the war expanded and intensified, the uneasy partnership between two totalitarian regimes began to show signs of strain. Each side gathered intelligence, repositioned forces, and prepared for contingencies that were no longer hypothetical. The question was no longer whether the pact would eventually be broken, but when, and at what cost. The answer would come with stunning suddenness, reshaping the war and redefining alliances in ways that few had anticipated. That collapse became impossible to ignore as events accelerated across Europe. Germany's rapid victories in Western Europe during 1940 shocked the world. France fell in a matter of weeks, and Britain was left standing alone against a triumphant Reich. For Stalin, these developments were deeply alarming. The assumption that Germany would remain bogged down in a long war against the Western powers was suddenly in doubt, and the strategic value of the non-aggression pact began to erode. Despite growing tension, cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union continued on the surface. Soviet oil, grain, and raw materials flowed steadily westward, sustaining the German war effort. In exchange, the Soviet Union received machinery, military equipment, and industrial technology. This uneasy partnership appeared stable, but beneath it lay profound mistrust. Each side was using the other, buying time, and preparing for a future conflict that both believed was inevitable. Within the Soviet leadership, conflicting assessments emerged. Some warned that Germany's ideological hostility made war unavoidable and imminent. Others believed Hitler would not risk attacking such a vast country, while Britain remained undefeated. Stalin himself leaned toward the latter view, convinced that Germany would delay any Eastern campaign. This belief shaped Soviet policy, discouraging full-scale defensive preparations and fostering a dangerous sense of caution. At the same time, German intentions were becoming clearer behind closed doors. Hitler had never abandoned his long-term vision of expansion eastward. The Soviet Union was not a partner in his eyes, but an obstacle and a target. German military planners began preparing for a massive invasion, even as diplomatic formalities with Moscow continued. The pact that had once shocked the world now served as a mask for the next phase of aggression. Tensions intensified in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Competing ambitions in Romania and surrounding regions strained relations further. Intelligence reports warning of German troop movements reached Moscow from multiple sources. Yet uncertainty, disbelief, and fear of provoking Germany led to hesitation. The fragile balance created in 1939 was unraveling, not with a sudden announcement, but through a steady accumulation of warning signs ignored or misinterpreted. Looking back, the failure of the earlier negotiations between the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France stands out as a decisive moment. Mutual suspicion, political hesitation, and competing priorities prevented the formation of a united front that might have altered the course of history. Instead, secret agreements replaced open cooperation, and smaller nations paid the price for decisions made without their consent. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not prevent war. It merely delayed and reshaped it. By removing obstacles to German expansion, it helped ignite a conflict that would engulf the world. By dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, it destroyed trust and sovereignty on a massive scale. And by relying on temporary advantage over lasting security, it set the stage for one of the greatest betrayals in modern history. As the pact's true nature became clear, its legacy endured far beyond its brief existence. It serves as a powerful reminder that diplomacy driven solely by fear and self-interest can have consequences as destructive as open warfare. The story of these failed negotiations is not just about treaties and borders, but about choices, miscalculations, and the human cost of political short-sightedness. In the end, what happened before the war proved just as decisive as what happened during it. The road to World War II was paved not only with tanks and armies, but with broken trust, missed opportunities, and agreements made in the shadows, decisions that changed the fate of millions and reshaped the world forever.